French Revolution. Learning about the abolition of slavery and the revolution and everyday life. The abolition of slavery. One of the most revolutionary social forms of the Jacobin regime was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. The colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Saint Domingo were important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. Europeans were reluctant to go, and work in distant and unfamiliar lands meant a shortage of labor on plantations. A shortage of labor on the plantations was met by a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The slave trade began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast, where they bought slaves from local chieftains. Branded and shackled, the slaves were packed tightly into ships for the 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. There, they were sold to plantation owners. The exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. Throughout the 18th century, there was little criticism of slavery in France. The National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of men should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies. Fearing opposition from businessmen whose incomes depended on the slave trade, it did not pass any laws. It was finally the Convention which in 1794 legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possessions. This, however, turned out to be a short-term measure. 10 years later, Napoleon reintroduced slavery. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the rights to enslave African Negroes in pursuit of their economic interest. Slavery was finally abolished in French colonies in 1848. Revolution and everyday life. Can politics change the clothes people wear, the language they speak, or the books they read? The years following 1789 in France saw many such changes in the lives of men, women, and children. The revolutionary governments took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality into everyday practice. One important law that came into effect soon after the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. In the old regime, all written material and cultural activities, books, newspapers, plays, could be published or performed only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. Now the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expressions to be a natural right. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures flooded the towns of France from where they travelled rapidly into the countrysides. They all described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. Freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. Each side sought to convince the others of its position through the medium of print. Plays, songs, and festive processions attracted large numbers of people. This was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in texts which only a handful of educated people could read. Conclusions. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. He set out to conquer neighboring European countries, dispossessing dynasties and creating kingdoms where he placed members of his family. Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws, such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. Initially, many saw Napoleon as a liberator who could bring freedom for the people. But soon the Napoleonic armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. He was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Summary. Many of his measures that carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of Europe had an impact on people long after Napoleon had left. The ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. These spread from France to the rest of Europe during the 19th century, where feudal systems were abolished. Colonized peoples reworked the idea of freedom from bondage into their movements to create a sovereign nation state. Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy are two examples of individuals who responded to the ideas coming from the revolutionary France. That is all in this lesson. Learning is fun.